In this episode, we're going to talk about setting limits. As I've gone through this first year of creating episodes for this podcast series on parenting, I am struck with how interrelated, how interconnected so many concepts that I'm talking about are. Setting limits is one of those that seems to be connected to so many other things. So what does setting limits do? Well, it keeps kids safe. It helps kids to stay healthy. Setting limits helps kids to create a balance and encourage self-control. Setting limits can help teach your child about being responsible. And setting limits can show your child that you care about them. You care about them enough to sometimes say no or not right now. I want to point out that much of what we talk about when it comes to setting limits is remarkably similar to some of the same things and concepts that are used in school. And I want to give a nod to a program that many schools use, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, called PBIS. And one of their mantras is really simple. It's being safe, being responsible, being respectful. And I always add being kind. If kids are doing those four things at home, at school, in the community, we don't have too much to gripe about. They're doing pretty well. And most of the rules that we have at home fall into those four categories, those four broad limits. Is your child being safe? Are they being responsible? Are they being respectful? And are they being kind? Virtually all expectations and limits established in schools and also in our families can fit under any one or even several of these guidelines. For example, if your child was pulling the tail on the dog, was that being respectful? Was that being kind? Was that being responsible? The answer would be no. If they were maybe juggling something that was really fragile or tossing it across the room, that's not being safe. That's not being responsible. That's not being respectful. And so I think that it would be easier for children to remember these four basic guidelines, or limits, if you will, because they're already familiar, if they're school-age children, if those same rules are talked about in the school setting. When we talk about limits, limits aren't things that kids are always excited about. You probably knew that. Limits have to make sense to you, but your child doesn't have to like them any more than you like doing dishes, laundry, paying taxes, or following speed limits on the roads. The point here is that limits just are. They help us to function as a society. They help us to function as a family. They help us to function as individuals. Limits. Is there a good reason not to have a big bowl of ice cream just before dinner? Is there a good reason why kids should really get a good night's sleep on school nights? And why don't we want our children to have the right kind of clothing when it's cold outside? And why do we not go on spending sprees with our children anytime they want something? It's because we have limits. Some strategies to consider when you're looking at the limits that you already have, or maybe the limits you want to change for your family. First is to be proactive. It is much easier to think ahead and anticipate problems than to be in reactive mode all the time. So much easier to prevent fires than to put them out once they've started. Now, we can never fully avoid surprises or mishaps, but it can sure reduce the time and frustration when we think ahead. So consider having rules about behaviors in the store or while traveling, having rules about how we treat others, and having rules around guidelines and routines around mealtime, morning routines, bedtime routines, homework and chore expectations. That's all about limits. Sometimes limits are framed as rules. When limits are presented as rules, it really makes it easier for children to remember them and for parents to use them. When they're complaining about why they can't have a third helping of something, or they can't have especially a treat, or they can't stay up later, it's because it's a rule. Why do I have to go to bed now? Because it's bedtime. Why can't I have a snack right now? Because we're going to eat dinner in just 10 minutes. Why can't I go on another sleepover this weekend? Because you've already been to one, and our limit is one once in a while, not 2 nights in a row. Limits are usually grounded in sound developmental theory, and they evolve with time. When establishing limits, it's really important to consider your child's developmental ability. It's no surprise that as children get older and acquire more skills for self-regulation and social connections, their world expands. They spend more time with friends. They may get a job outside of home. They may start babysitting, or they might start shoveling other people's sidewalks when it snows, or cutting grass or other chores. They learn to drive and become increasingly independent as they march toward adulthood. And even yet, teenagers still need limits. While this series of parenting tips focuses primarily on young and school-aged children, it's important to step back and recognize that the limits you set for a 3-year-old are going to be different than the limits that are set for a 13-year-old. Limits evolve with time. And remember, please, limits are meant to keep kids safe, help them learn to stay healthy, help create balance and encourage self-control, help teach children about being responsible. And when we set limits for our children, even if they don't like them, it shows that we care about them. Limits evolve as children grow and show more self-control and accept responsibilities. This does not mean your child or children will be happy about the limits you set when it is not what they want at the moment. But I have talked to many children, including my own, as adults, who have said, we weren't real happy about the screen limits you placed on us, but we now have so many other interests, so many other things that we really do because you really nurtured that in us. Give some thought to the limits that you set at home with your children. Are you satisfied with how they work for you? Do you find yourself in clashes with your kids about the limits you set? Consider adapting some version of the PBIS model, safe, responsible, respectful, and then I add kind, as a foundation for helping your children with limits. Thank you for tuning in and considering this parenting topic. I hope that this information added to your growing toolbox for parenting your child or children. Please consider exploring other topics in this series. Remember, no one parenting tool can do everything. We need many tools to become the best parents for our children. Your children's future depends on you and the time and effort you invest in them today.